Welcome to the first of a series of 3 webinars offered as part of the World University Network funded Research Methodologies in Education project, so the ReMiE project. My name is Lisa Kim and I'm the principal investigator for the project and the host for this webinar series. The ReMiE project was developed in response to the pandemic in order to understand the common and unique challenges and solutions that academics and PhD students experience in teaching, learning, and planning and conducting research methods, and also to provide capacity enhancement opportunities for education academics and students that strengthen research methodology expertise. The project consists of 3 work packages with collaborators joining the project from 6 countries across 5 continents. The first was a survey, the findings of which I will explain later in the presentation today. The second is this webinar series, and the third is further disseminations of the learning from the project to PhD students. Today's webinar series topic is on challenges and solutions to using and teaching research methodologies in education. And the presentation will be delivered by Professor Melanie Nind, followed by myself. So Professor Melanie Nind is a professor in education at the University of Southampton in the UK. Her research interests are inclusive research, learning disability, and research methods education. She is a co-director in the National Centre for Research Methods, so NCRM, which delivers a fantastic program of innovative and informative research methods training across the UK. And NCRM was particularly helpful in the pandemic for PhD students and staff in equipping researchers as we face the need to adapt our research during the pandemic.
So I'm going to be talking about some of the research that we did in the National Centre for Research Methods before the pandemic, because I think it's very relevant to after the pandemic, and it is very much a bridge between the education community and the methodology community, if you like. So the National Centre for Research Methods tends to provide training that's offered by really top-notch methodologists, people who are very, very experienced and knowledgeable about the methods and methodologies, but they aren't necessarily teachers by trade. So I'm both an educationalist and a methodologist, and I tend to be that bridge in the centre. And so my world has very much been about the challenges and solutions around research methods education, teaching research methods. And those challenges really came to the fore in the pandemic, of course. So I'm just trying to move my slides. There we are. So I'm going to be talking about the Pedagogy of Methodological Learning project. That's very hard to say. And we had extensive research questions. This was a big project with 3 researchers over a number of years. And we were looking at how advanced social science methods are taught and learnt. So PhD upwards. We're not interested in undergrad and master's learning in NCRM so much. How can methods teachers, their methodological and craft knowledge, how can that knowledge be articulated? What's distinctive about what they know and the challenges that they face in the classroom? And how do teachers respond to those challenges and build their pedagogical content knowledge? So don't worry, I am going to explain that concept if it's a new one to you. And it's that pedagogical concept knowledge that kind of underpins everything I'm going to say. But firstly, let's just make sure we're all on the same page with some key concepts. So my understanding of pedagogy is one shared in my field. It's this idea that it's not just what people do in teaching and learning situations, but it's what they believe to be meaningful, important, and relevant. So there's an underpinning to pedagogy. There's a bit that you don't see, And I love the idea from Jerome Bruner that pedagogy is never innocent. It always comes with baggage, if you like. And we can think of pedagogy, and we've written about this in our research methods for pedagogy book. We can think of pedagogy as specified, pedagogy as enacted, and pedagogy as experienced. But all of that complexity makes it jolly hard to know. And it makes it hard to know for researchers, and it makes it hard to know for teachers and learners as well. So if I just introduce pedagogic or pedagogical content knowledge, this is the idea that we have some pedagogic knowledge. We know things like learners attend more when the room's the right temperature, the windows are open, they're fed and watered, they know what's going to happen, they're motivated to be there, when we don't talk for too long, when we engage them, lots of things that we don't do in webinars, actually. We have all of that pedagogic knowledge. We also have content knowledge. So if I'm teaching a module or a session on case study, as I often do, I have all that kind of book knowledge, lived knowledge, discursive knowledge about what it is to do a case study. So that's my content knowledge. Now, my pedagogical content knowledge is where I bring those together and I apply my pedagogic knowledge to my content knowledge. And this concept came from Schulman in the 80s. It's a very old idea, but not an idea that's been applied much in research methods education until now. So this is the idea that when we've got good pedagogic content knowledge, that we can transform our content knowledge, our subject knowledge, into a form that learners can understand. We can predict where they might misunderstand. We can spot misunderstandings. It's that translation of the content knowledge. And some people have picked holes in the concept and said it's, you know, the idea of pedagogic content knowledge isn't dynamic enough, that we should be talking about pedagogical content knowing as a more active concept. But you can't just say to a teacher, tell me your pedagogic content knowledge, because they probably won't be able to tell you. Teachers in training might, because they're immersed in reflective dialogues and concepts and all the rest of it. But everyday methods teachers won't be able to necessarily just articulate what it is they know about how they teach research methods. And that disadvantages other people, but it disadvantages them as well. So our pedagogic content knowledge, it's easier for us to adapt it, shift it, make it fit new pandemic conditions or whatever new challenges come along, if we know it more explicitly rather than just tacitly. That's our thinking here. So in our research project, it was very much a multiple methods project, because we were attacking this thing about what do we know about the teaching, learning and research methods from different angles. And our starting point was knowledge about action. So we talked to pedagogic leaders. And by that, I mean the people who write the sorts of textbooks you can see on your screen: Johnny Saldana, Paul Vott, Ivona Lincoln, Bagel Chalisa, people who are really immersed in the world of teaching research methods and translating their knowledge, not just into the classroom, but into textbook type learning. And we wanted to really have discussions with them about the broad concepts, their knowledge about teaching. But this was, if you like, not so much specific, but more general knowledge. That we then went on to have a series of focus groups with ordinary methods teachers, if I can put it like that, based in universities, based outside universities, in organisations like NatSen or charities, and with teachers who were teaching methods online. And that was testing out some of the ideas that the experts were saying. But then it was important for us to try to understand this pedagogic knowledge in action. So to get away from the general to the specific, to the moment. And we used video stimulated recall, reflection and dialogue for that. And this is the idea that you're actually getting into moments of teaching. So we had some very nifty cameras, little tiny lightweight cameras that you could sucker to the window. And we had one faced on the teacher, one faced on the learners, recording a live methods teaching and learning session. And afterwards, holding a focus group with the teacher and the learners around what just happened and what were the pedagogic decisions and what were the key moments. So we might isolate a little piece of video and we might say, what was going on then? Why did you do that there? That was an interesting diagram you drew. Have you ever drawn that diagram before? And this led into really teasing out this pedagogic content knowledge in action. I'm not going to say much about this, but just to say we also wanted to know research methods education from the perspective of learners, and we did a longitudinal project taking people from the middle of their PhD through the end and into their role as an early career researcher, and asked them to diarise in a shared online diary their learning experience, whether it was from books, courses, experiences, and that turned into a very kind of rich discussion with each other around where do you learn this stuff. We also had 2 in-depth case studies, and this is about knowing PCK in depth, in context. So one of our case studies was around ethnographic technique, a long, thin module with doctoral learners. And it really exposed some of the PCK around how do you get people to know ethnographic data. And the students were required to read data aloud. And Johnny Saldana spoke about this in his interview, about embodying data. You know data by embodying it. Very rich knowledge came out of that case study. And the other case was a summer school, intensive summer school on advanced computational quantitative methods, which aren't things I know about so well. But you could really see this pedagogic knowledge around the exercises that students were required to do, the practice, the logic. It seemed that these methods were very much around the logic of each step. So if I take you to some of the findings and what that means for us, it was very clear in a way where pedagogic content knowledge comes from. It comes from our experiences of learning methods, being taught methods, teaching methods. It comes from our methodological experience in the field or in the lab. Sometimes it comes from formal training, but very often methods teachers don't have formal teacher training. Most pedagogic knowledge, it seemed to us, came from the challenges. So the challenges are the teacher. This is how we learn. And those challenges might be learner challenges, that the learner that doesn't get it. It might be from the context, the fact that your learner group is so diverse from all these different disciplines, some with prior knowledge, some not. That's challenging for teachers. Some of the challenges come from the subject matter itself. How do you teach someone to be reflexive? You know, that's not an easy thing to teach. And some of the challenges are from our own lack of expertise. But in terms of what you can use from all of this, we hit on this concept of pedagogic hooks. How do you hook the student in? How do you reel them in? And we need a pedagogic hook, don't we, whatever we're teaching about. And for methods teachers, it's data. What makes methods teaching and learning different is that it's all around teaching with, through, and about data. And data has all of these affordances for us. And we had very interesting discussions with teachers and learners about what was better to teach with, learners' own data or teacher data. Learners' data is data they can relate to, but it's often quite poor quality data. Teachers' data, you know, you can think about all of the teaching points in your own data. People were quite in favour of authentic data. So whatever the data is, it should come from real research projects, have real narratives behind, real problem solving going on behind the scenes. And learners of research methods are fascinated in the behind the scenes stuff. There's real value in immersing oneself in data and doing things with data. So this is all around this teaching and learning of research methods. And what's special about that PCK, that, you know, that set of PCK things wouldn't be associated with learning literature, say, or learning geography. And methods teachers use data to enable people to see the relevance of research, to get that spark of interest going. It enables people to actually experience doing research, to get their hands dirty or have flying time, one of our participants talked about. Teachers PCK includes how you communicate concepts, how you visualize data. Chris Wilde, who's a quantitative methods expert from New Zealand, was very powerful around you have to enable people to visualize quantitative data. And Charlene Hesse-Bieber, one of our experts, talked about the importance of methods not being disembodied. You can't teach them as disembodied entities. They have to be embodied in research problems and research findings. And so where does all of that leave us? I think it's important for us to understand that methods teachers transform their methodological knowledge into a form that's comprehensible to learners by working with data in very refined, careful ways. And that doesn't change in the pandemic. There are some of these that are truths. The pandemic changed the context. The move to online brought in all sorts of new contextual challenges. But the idea that we can translate what we know by using data in our teaching remains, I think, absolutely true. And it's very kind of important that we understand that once we begin to make our implicit knowing about teaching methods and methodologies, once we begin to have that known to us better through dialogue. So some of our interviews are about probing and picking and exploring and having that dialogue. That dialogue makes that knowledge known to us, and that makes it more shapeable. It's kind of easier for us to translate that to a new setting if we know it in a more transparent way or explicit way to when it's just tacit. In the past, people have said there has been a real kind of lack of pedagogical culture around research methods. So you can go to whole conferences on how to teach English as an additional language. There are whole journals dedicated to teaching English as an additional language. You won't find that in research methods education. There are special issues now. I did those. I'm doing editing at the moment, a whole big international handbook on the teaching and learning of social research. But this culture is growing very gradually. And without that culture, people, Mark Early said this in his systematic review, people are left to trial and error, and that's not a comfortable place to be. And the people who get given research methods to teach in universities tend to dread that, and it's the worst thing you could have to teach. What I want to see is methodologists who love methodology teaching research methods, but in ways in which they come to love pedagogy as well. And it's that sort of thing that will see us through our next big crisis, which I'm sure is looming, and it sees us through periods of uncertainty as well. So I hope that's helpful to people and not too off topic for the ReMiE project, Lisa. So thanks, and back over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you, Melanie, for that wonderful presentation. So many questions have been formulated in my mind, and I already see questions being asked in the chat box. So please do have those questions coming in. Maybe I'll ask a quick question before we move on to my presentation, and then we'll revisit the questions together right at the end. So I had a question about this building a culture of research methods. I really believe in that. I think it's so wonderful to talk to research methodologists and those who are teaching education, and then those people who have those two, are handling those two things. So people who are teaching research methods in education. How do we grow this culture, and what does that look like to you?
Yeah. It was Wagner and colleagues who first kind of highlighted this lack of pedagogic culture, and they were saying it was the lack of things like the conferences and the handbooks and that kind of thing, but also this lack of queuing into what people have done before. So this is why you had the trial and error thing, because people weren't even aware that other people were writing and there was published scholarship on how you teach research methods, and therefore people weren't citing each other's work, and therefore we weren't building cumulative knowledge. Everybody was like starting from ground zero. How do you teach research methods? Well, this isn't a phenomenon, isn't it? Whereas now, because we've had the big project, because we've been raising the issues about pedagogic culture, now people are much more encouraged to say, there's a literature about experiential learning of methods. There's a literature about active learning in research methods. I'll start with that. And how can I add to that? How can we apply, this is what we've been doing, experiential and active learning when we're online, teaching through Zoom? Can it still be experiential and active? Well, yes, it's just more challenging.
Speaking of which, I will share my insights in terms of how Zoom teaching research methods can be quite a challenge or quite beneficial, and seeing from different perspectives. So thank you, Melanie. And we'll visit the questions that are being posted in the Q&A at the end. So please do have those questions coming. Thank you. So in this presentation, I'll talk about the findings from a survey that collaborators from this project conducted, and also a quick reflection on my experience of teaching and assessing research method skills in our department. So just to give you a brief overview of the project. So this project started as a response to the pandemic, and it was also from my personal experience of and also observation around me, how people were needing to adapt their research projects, first of all, and also the way that they were teaching research methods, and then also how they needed to learn different research methods to not only conduct their own research, but also to teach them. So it was a reflection of all these things that were going around me. And I wanted to understand what were people's experiences of that. So from the perspective of PhD students and also research method instructors. And so the focus of this survey were on 3 time periods. So we had before the pandemic, which we defined as before March 2020. And then we also wanted to look at people's experiences in the first 6 months of the pandemic, which we defined as from March to September 2020. And then we also wanted to understand their current experiences in those manner. So in these three aspects, planning, teaching, and learning research methods. And so we defined that in the last 6 months of them completing the survey. And the kind of questions that we asked were about the factors that were contributing to their abilities to plan and conduct research, teach research methods, and learn research methods, and also their level of self-efficacy in those areas. Not only did we have Likert scale questions, we had 3 open-ended questions for those 3 aspects. So we wanted to understand the factors in more depth about of their abilities to do those things, and also how they responded to these factors as well. So we wanted to understand their unique factors that they experienced and how they responded. And also we also wanted to understand what help would they like in the next 6 months in response to the challenges that they were experiencing. And so this was a 15-minute anonymous survey that was circulated all around the world using various recruitment strategies. And this was released in June 2022. But unfortunately, only 13 people completed the survey, which was a little bit of a disappointment because we really wanted to understand in a more in-depth way of people's experiences of teaching, learning, and conducting research. And of those 13 participants, 5 of them said that they were part of the World University Network. And also there were 9 were from the UK, and then there was more females and males, and there were a variety of disciplines, and 12 PhD students completed it, and 6 of people also said that they were teaching research methods. So perhaps it's I thought that we could reflect on the findings from the qualitative side of things from the survey rather than the quantitative, given our small sample size. So what I'll do is share with you some quotes that participants have shared in their open-ended responses, and then we can reflect on those 3 aspects of planning and conducting research, teaching, and learning research methods. So participants named various factors that were affecting their ability to conduct and plan research. So one was the suitability of the research methodologies and research methods that they were using, and the projects that they were planning, and how they needed to have different contingency methods. So one participant said that they believed that Q methodology is better executed in person, but they needed to then provide extra justifications for their choices and the validity of the research, given that they had to conduct it online. So we see that people are needing to provide greater justifications for what they're doing, especially given that it wasn't something that was done before the pandemic in terms of online execution of the methodology. And this participant said, I ended up redesigning my project multiple times and feel that I'm constantly having to upskill myself to meet the technical expertise and experience needed to work with internet-based methods in a very isolated context. So it seems that, first of all, there was a lack of technical expertise and experience, and this participant needed to upskill themselves to meet that, and they're constantly needing to redesign their projects depending on the situation of the pandemic and what they thought they were able to do. And all this in the context of a very isolated context. So needing to upskill themselves whilst being at home. Access to facilities was also a factor that were affecting people's research. And so this participant said, government overreaction to the unpleasant cough locked me out of the lab for the first several months of the pandemic. This was a disaster for practically focused experimental research, and how it affected academics and researchers in terms of the scientific progress, and they're willing to speak up in favor of the Swedish way of keeping calm, keep working, and continue to make scientific progress. So this participant believed that there were different access to facilities was affecting their research. And also the recruitment bias towards certain groups was named here. So this participant named that there was a skewed, the participants were skewed towards participants with higher language proficiency, digital literacy, and internet access. There was also a note of the change over time. So this participant said that my potential participants are beginning to feel more able to engage and have more time alongside a generally higher level of technical access and proficiency, enabling remote research, such as interviews, to be conducted more easily than early on in the pandemic. So it seems like there are various factors affecting people's research, from access to facilities, the type of methodologies, and the recruitment bias that may have been going on. There were also positive sides. So one participant named that there was an improved information technology infrastructure, allow for more flexibility in the planning and data analysis aspect of my research. So there were also positives here. But there was also a note by a participant about the effects that mental health was having on their ability to conduct research, and noting a particular family situation that they were experiencing. So various things seems to be going on, and people responded to these factors in various ways. Some people waited. So my intended planned research included being physically present. So a lot of the early stages of the pandemic were spent waiting and putting things on hold. Others did what they could in the resources that they were given. So I pivoted to focus on completing work towards publications, background reading, learning opportunities, and planning for the use of new technologies to answer outstanding research questions. Others adapted their research methods, design and analysis. It was made more difficult as we didn't know how long we would be dealing with restrictions. So I was constantly creating parallel plans, depending on whether it would be worth waiting until I could conduct an in-person research again. By September, it was clear that the situation would extend for a longer period of time, and that's when I began to accept that I wouldn't be able to do the project I had planned, and stopped making so many contingency plans. It was very draining. So this participant adapted with various parallel plans, and it seemed to have quite a draining consequence on them. Others changed also their execution of the methods, and then how their data, the data set that they would accumulate, and thereby the analysis they would conduct. And as referred to earlier, people upskilled themselves in various ways. So attending training for online research methods and completing tutorial for different online experiments to build the platforms to figure out where would be best to host my experiment. So people were using the online resources that were available to them to this. So people advocated in response to what they believed were the factors that were affecting their research. So noting the participant who advocated for a Swedish way of responding to the pandemic. This participant said, I contacted every scientific organization I could to pressure for the Swedish way, and contributed to a website with advice on how scientists opposed to lockdown could formulate arguments as to why lockdown's damage to science outweighed any risks COVID posed. So there seemed to be a variety of ways that researchers responded to the factors that were affecting the pandemic, all the way from waiting and adapting to their research, as well as advocating. What help did researchers ask for? So resource and community was a common theme. So more guidance and assistance with online research options, clarity on best practice for face-to-face sessions, and hybrid options to allow people choice depending on comfort level. And I think this might be relevant as we emerge from the pandemic, in that sometimes we may opt to conduct virtual modes of research, or face-to-face may be preferred, or somewhere in between. And I wonder what kind of guidance and assistance we can equip researchers to decide which may be the most appropriate for their particular situation. More opportunities to meet people in my department using the same methods and analysis would also help a lot. This is slowly improving as people return to the office. So this formation of a community of people who can advise each other using the same research methods and analysis may be helpful. And this can be, and this participant mentioned in the department context. And I also reflect on the wider, given our discussion about research culture, research methods culture, I wonder what community we can be part of or create in regards to that as well. Flexibility and support. So this participant, it seemed to be, they seemed to be a PhD student, and what they said was, my project was put back by around a year and I was granted a 3-month funding extension, but I'm now struggling with a lot of anxiety as my funding will finish at least 6 months before I will be ready to submit. So this, because of the pandemic and their ability to conduct their research had been impeded, it had consequences on the length of time that they were able to finish everything. And so that was a flexibility and support, and their experience of anxiety around that was noted here. This participant asked for more time in a similar way. The university is pushing for tighter deadlines. They want postgraduate researchers to submit within their 3 years. But I also want to continue to participate in other research projects now that the opportunities are appearing. Obviously, these take a portion of my time, so I can't do that much work on research projects in case it impacts on my PhD submission. So this first participant 1 had noted the pandemic had restricted the amount of time, so there's a restriction of time because of that. But this participant is also noting, as a PGR, they want to be participating in other research projects, but they also note that there's this pressure to complete their PhD within the 3 years, and how they could handle those 2 things is something that's on their mind. Academic support, additional time on research, extension of visa, and so I believe this participant is an international student, and some understanding that it's taking a bit more time to process things, so as a result of the mental health experience that they were having. This participant noted that throughout the pandemic, the quality of the supervision with their supervisor was sporadic, and so what they wanted was more regular supervision. But they also recognize that the workload for staff is high. People also wanted certainty about the future. And so this participant said, I'm fortunate to work for a supportive PI and to have a clear idea of the research questions that we want to answer. I do, however, have an end date to my contract, and some aspects of research planning would be aided by understanding the likelihood of securing further funding. So I think this is a reflection wider than just in the experience of a pandemic. I think this is perhaps a common experience of researchers generally. And this person also advocated for a proper constitution is the terminology that they used. Factors affecting research, so access to technology and health implications of the students was certainly noted, as well as the wider health implications on both students and teachers. This was an interesting point, students' practical skills and attendance. So the research methods I've taught are mostly the practical skills involved in experimentation, debugging, and prototyping. Teaching completely stopped for these things during the pandemic. I fear these students may never get the full appreciation of these practicalities of doing many kinds of lab-based research. And so we wonder the kind of exposure and experiences and the skills that students may have missed out on as a result of the pandemic. And this can have, and this participant reflected on the wider kind of implications of that. Students were highly motivated to work in the labs after the pandemic to gain relevant experience for jobs, PhD applications. However, their relative lack of prior practical experience created a longer lag time than for previous cohorts as they caught up with the very basics of working in a research lab. So I think that's very interesting to know. I'm glad all the teaching this year has been in person. However, attendance can be very poor, and some students rely too heavily on the catch-up materials and miss out on what is discussed in class. However, this is not specific to research methods. So just general observation about low attendance and engagement. Virtual working afforded this participant discussed how it was beneficial for them, as they were able to work as a graduate teaching assistant virtually, which was something that was not possible before. And in terms of the responses and the help that people wanted to assist in the teaching of research methods, so they noted this change in mode from going totally practical to remote to then hybrid. And people wanted certainty about the future, as well as some resources that will be helpful to assist in this way. The factors that were affecting and the responses to and helping for learning. So we had people noting the resources that are required. So the main difficulty was finding resources and not really knowing what I was looking for at the start of the pandemic, especially as there was a huge deluge of information to navigate in some ways. Also, I still miss in-person support with more technical expertise in talking about the specifics of my research. There are so many online tutorials and expectations. You can teach yourself so much, but then they are very general and often too basic to apply to your own research. So this note of assisting people in understanding where to find those resources and perhaps providing more bespoke and specific training. People in response to the pandemic and their need to learn research methods that people read and attended tutorials and online tutorials, and people advocated for more in-person support, as well as adaptations of research communities to adapt the current ways of thinking. So these were the findings from the survey, but please do note that the sample size was very small. We do reflect on why it maybe have been the case. Maybe people have been experiencing survey fatigue. I know that people are all very tight on their time at the moment as well, so that could be another factor. And also, I do wonder whether maybe there's a smaller population of research methods instructors generally, and which could have affected the sample size as well. But for me, the greatest takeaway from the survey findings was people's valuing of the training and support, and particularly if it is in person and if it is more specific to whatever methodology or project that they may be conducting or using. And I wanted to give a very quick reflection about teaching and research method skills. So we talked about it in terms of people's experiences generally and perhaps in a more holistic way. I wanted to describe what is happening in our department and some questions that I'm having, which can be something that we can pick up in the discussion section of this webinar. So maybe I should start off with, I teach second year research methods to undergraduate students in our department, and I'm also the assessment lead for undergraduate programs in our department. So I look after all the assessment formats in our undergraduate programs. So thinking about my module, which is a second year research methods module. So pre-pandemic, we had an hour lecture and then 2 hours of practical. So they would go into a computer lab and then work on the various exercises on SPSS and so forth. During the pandemic, of course, they can't come to class and the practicals couldn't be done on campus. So what the department did was we did a pre-recorded lecture. So we uploaded a pre-recorded lecture that students can access anytime, and then had a live meet the tutor. So I would go online on Zoom and then do some hands-on quick exercises with them and answer any questions that they may have had. We also had live Zoom practicals. So the practicals that would have been online in class, in the computer labs, we did it through sharing the screen and doing it, going through the analysis on SPSS and so forth, as well as having weekly online drop-in sessions with any questions that students may have on Zoom. So those were the ways that we taught research methods. And now that we are slowly emerging from the pandemic, we're going back to our pre-pandemic provisions of doing an hour lecture, 2 hour practicals, as well as now we're offering weekly in-person drop-in sessions as well. And teaching live Zoom practicals was quite a challenge, especially thinking about the practicalities of things. So we would share our screen and students would look at look at what we're doing, but they also need to learn how to do that in their own computer. So how does one then look at what we're doing as well as do it on their computer? And then that really does rely on their high internet connectivity levels in the student's home as well. So we did face a few practical challenges along the way in teaching research methods. And in terms of assessing them, so pre-pandemic, this module was the students' knowledge and skills were tested using a timed invigilated on-campus exam. So students would come on campus, and then it will be they would do an exam in a period of time. And but during the pandemic, of course, they couldn't come on campus. So the university, with the various regulations, we offered a 24-hour online exam. And now that we are offering timed online exams. So it's not invigilated on-campus exams. We are releasing our online exams, and then students need to download and upload their answers within a specific period of time. And there are certain challenges with that. And what the future might look like is something that I need we're in discussion about, and it'll be really interesting to hear people's perspectives on what assessment formats will be valuable in testing students' research method skills. And the challenges that we're experiencing now with teaching and assessing research method skills is, of course, first of all, student attendance engagement. That's a general issue, and that may not be just specific to research methods, but that is certainly an issue in teaching this topic. And when we contemplated bringing back timed invigilated exams for the current set of assessments, there was a general anxiety about exams that students let us know about, especially given that some cohorts had not experienced timed invigilated exams, for example, in their high school years. So we need to be mindful of that as we propose different assessment methods. And also this question of academic integrity. So if we do online assessments, how do we ensure that students might not be copying and pasting the answers, for example, and that it is indeed independent students' work? So this question of academic integrity is something that that we face. And then this also leads to training people who are teaching research methods in developing exams and questions that would be suitable to test teach students' research method skills in using that particular format. That's my reflections from the ReMiE project survey, as well as my experience of teaching and assessing research methods. You can find out more about the project using the link above, and then it will be also posted in the chat as well. And I'd like to thank the project survey team. So these are the people who contributed to the development of the survey, and so I'm very thankful to them. Melanie, it'll be great if we can have a conversation on this topic. So I see that there are quite a lot of questions. It'll be great if we can discuss them. Maybe I'll post the first one to you, and then we can go from there. So someone has noted that they're using PCK in their own research, and you draw out data in your findings. But what about collecting and generating data? Do you have any response to that?
Yes, I mean, the generating the data was through the methods that I described, the expert panel interviews, the video stimulated recall, the case studies, the diary. So that generated a lot of data, and the pedagogical content knowledge part of it was just one strand that we analysed and tried to identify. That it was primarily a kind of thematic analysis type approach, and we tried to tease out in our analysis whether there was a distinctive PCK for quant methods or qual methods or other kinds of methods, and there is a definite kind of difference between what you're needing to translate and how you're translating it between quant and qual. As much as our funding councils and various people would like us to stop using that dichotomy, I think it is still real. Yeah.
Great. Thank you. And there was a question about a specific methodology that you are using in your ethnographic research, that is using the video cameras. And can you elaborate, or can you give an example of pedagogic content knowledge uncovered through that research, please?
Yeah. And just to clarify that the use of the video cameras, that wasn't ethnographic. They were come in for one day, record the training, and then facilitate the video stimulated recall and reflection and dialogue, and then we left again. So there was no ethnographic immersion in that. But I did see that question in the chat, and I was reflecting on one example which was really quite interesting, and it's where after the session we were bringing students and teachers together in dialogue. And how rarely that actually happens, that people, teachers and their students sit down and discuss what was going on. And this was a session that had just been about systematic review, advanced level systematic review, synthesis methods and stuff. And some of the participants had come from a quant background and some from a qual background, and the tutors were very, very experienced in these methods, but not necessarily immersed in pedagogic debate. And the students brought up the thing about we would have liked more time in small groups to discuss that. And the teacher was exposing their vulnerability to, I don't like to leave you on your own in small groups for too long, because I feel this weight on me as a teacher to keep moving, to keep delivering, to keep structuring your learning. And there became a whole kind of discussion about the importance of teachers trusting learners to process, to discuss, to make sense of collectively what's just happened, and the importance of making time for that in classrooms or online classrooms. And that was quite interesting. So it's less an example of exposing pedagogic content knowledge as creating pedagogic content knowledge, because this teacher was really kind of listening to these learners and saying, but don't you feel like I should be getting on with it, and you're not getting your money's worth if I'm not talking to you? And they were saying, no, we need time together. There are questions we would ask each other that we wouldn't ask you. So yeah, very interesting example.
So I'm thinking about the concept of reflexivity here from both the instructor's perspective as well as the student's perspective. And I can also imagine that this is not just an experience of research methods instructors, but also in other modules, and even, primary and secondary school teachers, there is a amount of content that need to be delivered in a certain period of time, and the time pressure of needing to ensure that every aspect is then discussed and delivered in that kind of in-depth way. There's this pressure of time as well. How would then one balance this kind of discussion of in-depth, having those in-depth discussions with needing to get on and teach?
Yeah, I mean, this is really refined pedagogic content knowledge, isn't it? As one of the big bits of decision making you have to do. How do I organize the time I've got available? What's critical? What can happen pre-session, post-session? But sometimes I think what teachers forget is that time when learners together is very precious, actually, and that we need to make the most of it. But Lisa, I'm aware we're discussing my bit of the session and not your bit of the session. I think it's very interesting, your survey and what people are doing. We did something very similar in the changing research practices in response to COVID-19 project in NCRM, and I put the link to that on the chat. But what the method we used wasn't survey. And I think survey has its limitations, doesn't it, when you're talking about something that's complex and emotional, because it was such a kind of emotionally impactful thing, the pandemic, on us as researchers and teachers, as well as just human beings and family members and things. But we used a method where we had knowledge exchange, and people came together on Zoom to talk about where their projects were up to, what was happening to them, what they were having to change. And the idea was that people learned from each other's experiences. But one of the things we used was a river metaphor. So we asked students to draw their research as a river going along and what had happened with the pandemic. And we had wonderful kind of metaphorical tools of the thunderbolt and the lightning and the dam falling across the river of the research. And I just wonder really what you feel now about whether a survey is a good method to get at what was happening to people and their methods and their teaching of methods in the pandemic.
I think I can make a reflection on the type of method, but also the timing as well. So reflecting on the timing though. So I think this may have been an observation for other research projects as well. I think at the very beginning of the pandemic, people were in a state of shock, understandably, and they wanted to perhaps do what they could to help research in this way, and especially now that they were adjusting to home working and so forth. So I think participating in different research projects may have increased then. And then with time, maybe it lapsed as people realized that this pandemic was going to go for quite a while, and they had already participated in a lot of research projects in the beginning. So I do wonder whether there was like a decline in people's engagement and interest in participating in different research projects, and our low sample size may have been a manifestation of that. In terms of the suitability of using survey to understand people's experiences, I think it can have advantages and disadvantages. Advantage being it's easy to circulate and it's easy to for participants to present their experiences and their opinions in a time that is suitable to them, and especially if it's an international survey. So that's an advantage. However, a disadvantage is that I think, again, it's just people may perceive it as another survey that's in their inbox. So there may be low engagement interest in that. And also, I do wonder how much we can ask follow-up questions and ask in-depth questions to truly understand their experiences and the nuances of their experiences, in which a more perhaps interviews or focus group discussions may have been more helpful in that way. So I think there are certainly advantages and disadvantages of certain research methodologies generally, and especially in this time as well. Wonderful. I am aware of the time, and I'm sorry that we haven't been able to answer all the questions that are on the chat, but perhaps it's something that we can continue to discuss in our communities, and also contribute to the development and the thriving of research methods, education communities, and culture. So thank you very much, Professor Melanie Nine, for contributing to this webinar. And as a reminder, there is another 2 webinars next Wednesday and next Friday, if you'd like to join us. And more information can be found on the website as well. So thank you again, everyone, and hopefully see you next week. Bye-bye.